Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's September 30th, and some issues have come up recently regarding the Ukraine war that I was not aware of, and I wanted to just do an overview, again, an overview of how this war started, what the roots of it actually were, and actually have been. So I just, jotted some notes down. So I've got an article that I'm going to read with some interjections on my part to give you a little bit more background on it. So I'm calling this the roots of the Ukraine war. It all started in the minds of Western leaders. The Ukraine conflict and the Ukraine war origins, often portrayed as a response to Russian aggression, has deeper roots in the ideological and psychological framework of Western leadership. This essay explores how historical ambitions, economic missteps, and a refusal to acknowledge self-inflicted wounds have driven the crisis, aligning with Oswald Spengler's 1921 prophecy, The Decline of the West, where he foresaw the West's decline despite its apparent power. I've written about this in previous articles and videos, where basically after World War I, a German historian named Oswald Spengler wrote an overwhelming history of civilizations and their rise and fall. And he basically predicted that Western civilization had reached its apex in World War I by the beginning of the 20th century, and that war essentially, in his view, marked the beginning of the end of the European project. Here we are 100 years later, and his predictions seem to be coming largely true. So I'm going to give just some examples of symptoms that I personally saw. And for example, there's energy disputes and economic self-sabotage. So Poland has historically had a problem with Russia. It's invaded Russia. Russia has invaded them back. They've been going back and forth for centuries. But in any case, after World War II, maybe go back a little bit earlier, 1934, Poland signed a non-aggression, a kind of basically a peace treaty, a non-aggression pact with the Nazi regime, and within 5 years it got invaded. Wrong move, Poland. The Soviet government said to Poland, "Hey, maybe we should help you out if we have some troops in Poland. It might help you out." Poland said, "No, you dirty Russians. We don't want you. We don't want you." So of course Poland got overrun, and they lost several million people. It was a disaster for Poland. And then of course after Russia and Soviet Union reinvaded Poland, to go through Poland all the way to Germany, because they knew they had to physically remove the Nazi regime from power, and there was no negotiation. It was unconditional surrender. But in any case, Poland, as a member of the Warsaw Pact, things went reasonably well, but at a certain point, relations broke down. Poland wanted to didn't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact, and eventually it became part of NATO, in fact. And but it was still getting energy from Russia, and Russia was giving them a fixed price. This is stuff that probably most of you don't know about this, but Russia was giving them a fixed price for it was like a long-term mortgage where you pay a certain fixed percentage of your mortgage, and it's fixed for the entire period of time. Russia had said to Poland, and they had agreed, "Poland, you're going to pay a fixed price for our gas." But it turns out that the long-term fixed price was more expensive than a cheaper short-term price. Just like with bonds, if you have a bond, the longer-term bonds are usually cost more than the short-term bonds. So Poland broke they said, "We don't like this." They took Russia to court. "How dare you take advantage of us?" And then when the short-term rates on energy went up, Poland found itself on the short end of the stick again. They couldn't just have decent relations with Russia. pay a little bit more for their energy, which was reasonably priced in the first place, and they wouldn't have had this problem. But because of this deep-seated animosity that Poland has towards Russia, and I'm sure there are polls, oh, Russia's terrible, they're always bad, bad, bad. But from what I can see, as somebody who's just kind of looked at the history, it appears to me that Poland has a long-term problem with Russia, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But in any case, it marked. This was a first inkling that I had that there was going to be trouble brewing, and there's also, as I mentioned, Poland has a centuries-long antipathy towards Russia, partly rooted in the fact that Poland became a Roman Catholic country, whereas Russia is obviously Russian Orthodox. And there's been the Catholic Church has had this idea that it is the church and everybody else should just follow the church, and if you don't, you're bad and we're going to have to do something bad to you. And of course that has resulted in numerous wars. So in any case, one of the reasons why Poland has this antipathy towards Russia is because it's Catholic rather than Russian Orthodox. But it also had its own imperial ambitions. I think it was called the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was in existence for a while. They incorporated part of Russia. Russia eventually kicked them out, and it's gone back and forth. But in any case, there was this kind of ongoing, underlying animosity of Poland towards Russia. Now, another indication of this situation was Germany's misstep with Nord Stream. And as we know, Germany also had very favorable treatment from both the Soviet Union and from Russia in terms of their energy contracts. Russia was and before that the Soviet Union was providing Germany with very reasonable costs for their energy. And as a result, Germany's economy was doing quite well, very, very well. But again, these kinds of ancestral obsessions with Russia, seem to have reared their ugly head, and as a result, the United States basically said to Germany, "You're not going to use, cheap Russian energy because they're enslaving you with their cheap Russian energy. So you have the privilege of paying for our expensive American energy, and that's going to give you freedom." And the German, leadership went along with that. Of course, I think it was Olaf Scholz was standing right next to Joe Biden when Joe Biden expressed the intent of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. And Olaf Scholz didn't say a word. Why? What was going on there? That's the question I'm asking myself and opposing here. So the fact is that there is a history of Western interventions and coups in the dream of subjugating Russia. So, for example, there were actually 2 coups in Ukraine. Ukraine was never a NATO member, but it became a focal point for the West's long-standing ambition to subjugate Russia, exploit its resources, and bolt its debt-ridden finances. And I want to point out here that in a recent, very, very revealing interview that this fellow named Patrick Babb gave on YouTube with Glenn Deason, who's an independent journalist, pointed out the fact that the Europeans have their economies are severely crippled with debt, and they need to increase the collateral, so to speak. So that was a major reason motivating their attack on Russia, using Ukraine to do it. So there was a 2004 Orange Revolution where there was a democratically elected government. They created a lot of protests. They redid the election. miraculously, the democratically elected president is deposed, and this new guy comes in. He's president for a while, and that's not working out. So they rehired, so to speak, Yanukovych to be the president of Ukraine. Yanukovych had a far more neutral, or roughly somewhat more friendly stance towards Russia than it did towards Europe, whereas Yushchenko, who was the president in 2004, following that replay of the election, he immediately recognized Stefan Bandera as a hero. So you could see Ukraine was just going down the wrong track. No, you could say from their point of view, well, we're just being nationalistic, okay, but what has it gotten Ukraine? That's the issue. Okay, so Babb also pointed out, and this is very important, this is something I had not known. I thought this was a completely U.S.-backed coup, with Victoria Nuland orchestrating it and Joe Biden giving the final okay for it. This is all done under the Obama administration. For those of you who say that the Democrats are better than the Republicans, just forget about that. So it turns out that during the protests against the Yanukovych government that had been orchestrated by Victoria Nuland, it turns out that investigations have shown that there were 100 deaths by snipers, and it was blamed on the Yanukovych regime. However, as Babb points out, and there's another fellow, a Canadian researcher in Ottawa, the name escapes me at the moment. He points out that the European leaders made a deal with foreign fascist snipers to create chaos, and they agreed on the number of 100. So they called it the Heavenly 100. These people, they were either policemen or it was just they just shot at anybody just to create chaos and create so much difficulty for Yanukovych that he felt compelled to sign an interim peace agreement with the protesters, which the protesters immediately broke the next day, and that was what was the cause of the coup. So, and of course, this has been corroborated by numerous investigations since then. So there's another aspect of this, and that is the political corruption and suppression of dissent. So again, one of the points that came out in this interview with between Glenn Deason and this Patrick Babb was that in Germany, accusations of corruption taint the Green Party, especially. But you wonder, why is it that the Social Democrats and the Christian parties were apparently, I'm not sure about those parties, but for sure there was evidence that the Green Party was basically bought off. And it's very strange to me personally how the Green Party started off as a peace party, and it went radically, pro-war, backing wars instead of peace. So this is very strange. And but on the other hand, you had true left parties like Die Linke and Sarah Wagenknecht's alliance are marginalized for their anti-war stance, reflecting a broader suppression of dissent. And the Alternative for Germany party, which is they call it a right-wing party, despite its increased popularity, has been targeted to be excluded from elections, and several of its recent candidates have died. A none too coincidental series of deaths. So when you have like 10 or more candidates from a party dying before an election, there's something going on there. Then we have the crushing of dissent in UK and France. In the UK, leftist figures like Jeremy Corbyn and George Galloway have been faced with exclusion from the Labour Party for challenging pro-native narratives. And in France, Emmanuel Macron's opponents encounter authoritarian tactics during protests against pension reforms and his right-wing alliances, stifling oppositions. I might also mention, I forgot to mention this in the article, but Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor at the moment, and who's losing popularity by the minute practically, and Emmanuel Macron are both bankers. How does a banker, get into position of power? How did Trump, who's a billionaire, get into a position of power? Well, people can say whatever they want about how much they hate, Trump, but the fact is that there are people who have a lot of money who know how to influence elections. Let's just leave it at that. So there was also neo-colonial meddling in Eastern Europe. So the EU and NATO's interference in Romanian and Moldovan elections enforces alignment with anti-Russian agendas, forbidding dissent against their projects. And we know this: the Romanian election was overturned by nefarious means, depriving the Romanian people of their choice of president. And here we have in Moldova similar situation where, if you've heard recent reports, the Moldovan authorities under President Sandu they blocked the bridge so that people from the pro-Russian part of Moldova couldn't vote, and they didn't supply voting possibilities for the many Moldovan expats in Russia, but they provided lots of possibility for people to vote who live in the European Union. And the vote against Sandu's party was won with votes internal to Moldova, but she won her narrow victory, 50.2%, based on the EU faction of the Moldovan electorate, excluding the Russian faction. So that's what you got there. Then there's the other issue of what I call media groupthink and historical hypocrisy. So the phenomenon of bot journalists was exposed by a fellow named Udo Olfkottes Verkauften Journalisten, which is a German word meaning bot journalists. And it perpetuates a narrative that stifles truthful analysis. So here's this guy. He was a significant person. I think was an editor at a news magazine, and basically he got sick and tired of being bribed or pressured by the CIA to write stories, or I should say to implant stories written for him under his name in favor of the West. And he said that many of the journalists, if not all of them, are in that same situation. If you write the truth, you're going to be in the back desk of the editorial office, and if you say what you're told to say, you'll be rewarded with nice trips and gifts and in a better career, quote unquote career. That's why Paul Craig Roberts calls these people prostitutes, a take on prostitutes. They've sold out their journalistic integrity to write lies. This is basically what we're talking about here. Another aspect of this, which came out earlier in a very interesting discussion between Elizabeth Murray, who was a former CIA officer, and Regis Tremblay, a personal friend of mine. They were discussing this problem, and she pointed out that after 9/11, the accurate assessments were ignored, and the skewed assessments were favored. And within CIA culture itself, critical thinking, objective thinking was actively discouraged. As they said of the Iraq War, the facts were fixed around the policies. In other words, we're not going to tell you what really is true. We're going to, based on the policies, we're going to give the public quote-unquote facts. And this I also want to tie in with the fact that, Stephen Kotkin, who's a professor of Russian history, has pointed out that when U.S. politicians say things to the public, there's something called a public policy, and there's a private policy. The public policy is the lies that they tell people to get you into the war, and the private policy is we got to do something because our balance sheet is messed up, and we got to invade Venezuela that has a lot of oil, or Iraq that has a lot of oil, or Russia that has a lot of oil, and get those assets onto our balance sheet because our debt is so bad. So, but this is kind of an institutional corruption that's endemic across the board in Europe and in the United States. So we have people like Friedrich Merz and Macron who warn of a Russian threat, ignoring the fact that their nation's historical invasions, Napoleon's 1812 invasion and Germany under Hitler, were terribly damaging to Russia. Did Russia just pop up one day and say, we're going to invade Germany and France? No, they didn't. Likewise, under the UK, Keir Starmer has been funding Ukraine while disregarding its own history of attacks. It attacked Russia in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. And in 1917, following the Russian Revolution, the British invaded the new Soviet Union in order to, quote-unquote, strangle Bolshevism. So the aggression has been on the side of the West. Russia has never invaded England. It's never threatened England. And yet England is constantly threatening, blaming, orchestrating all kinds of warlike activities against Russia. And even now, British and French missiles shoot at Russia, and they say Russia's the threat. So who's the threat? Well, they're a threat because if we shoot enough missiles at Russia, maybe Russia will take the gloves off and start shooting missiles at Paris and London. So I go on and I talk about the decline of the West, which is I call it a Spenglerian reality. Europe's collapsing colonial project. Spengler's Decline of the West predicted the collapse of Europe's colonial project. Today, Europe faces defeat in Ukraine, an inability to intimidate Russia. It has a weakened industrial base due to high energy prices, at least, not to mention deindustrialization, which was going on anyway in favor of financialization. Michael Hudson has talked about this. It's a lot easier to push paper and make profits on paper and get rich that way than it is to build a real economy where you have to pay workers a fair price, a fair wage, and provide services to people that help them and uplift the society as a whole. No, we're not going to do that. It's concentration of wealth in a small group of hands, and the people be damned, and the entire industrial economy be damned. So they're slitting their own throat by these kinds of policies. But in addition, because of these kind of shift in the winds of geopolitical reality, after World War II, the European colonial powers gradually and more lost control of their colonies. The reason why Europe became rich was because they stole the assets of the countries that they invaded. That's just the reality of it. Indians then from India claim that the British, they completely deindustrialized India, which had a significant portion of the world's GDP before being colonized by the British, and it was driven into complete poverty. So that's been a serious problem. But you see, in response to that, BRICS is that's Britain, or rather Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have been joined by several other countries, and now and there are other partner countries. So you have the we can say the BRICS world is really beginning to dominate the collective West, which is basically the United States and the EU, certainly in terms of population as well as industrial output, and now even in terms of military. So there are schizophrenic responses in magical thinking that are involved here on the part of Europeans. The Western leaders exhibit schizophrenic rhetoric, simultaneously claiming that Russia will invade, and at the same time its economy is in tatters from sanctions that they imposed that have backfired. They deliberately signed up to be vassals of the United States, and they lie continually, about these issues. Russia's in tatters. They take computer chips out of washing machines. Keith Kellogg, the retired American general, is now the envoy to Ukraine, and he says things that are just blatantly ridiculous, and people are supposed to believe him. But that's why I call this magical thinking. That they think that the West is so impressed by their own history of domination that they can't let go of the idea that they're actually losing, and in fact fundamentally they have lost. It's all over but the shouting, as they say. So, and the more they struggle against it, the worse it gets. Russia gave them numerous chances to negotiate and work through this problem that has been ongoing since the fall of the Soviet Union and NATO breaking its agreements and expanding westward and continually threatening Russia. Russia's tried to negotiate many, many times, and yet they say, and J.D. Vance says, Russia refuses to negotiate. Well, no, Russia refuses to capitulate. Russia's willing to negotiate, but they're not willing to capitulate. And with the leaders of the West, they think that negotiation means capitulate. It's called the rules-based order. We create the rules and you take orders from us. So in conclusion, I'll say that what we need is the roots of the Ukraine conflict lie not in Moscow, but in the minds of Western leaders. They're driven by imperial nostalgia and the denial of their fading power. As Spengler foresaw, Europe's evening brings desperation leading to self-destructive policies. Resolution demands introspection, not escalation, to address the West's role in creating the crisis. So that's the issue. As I've mentioned on many times, this is a psychological problem. It's a spiritual problem that the West has. It is so impressed by its own egotistical notions of superiority that it just cannot let go of that. And as it gets more and more desperate, it does more and more desperate things. So the question, continually arises: will they find a way to gracefully let go of their pretensions and just become normal countries? And even if they do become normal countries, it's going to be very difficult for many of those countries, especially Europe, because they don't really. It's not a resource-rich area. The United States is a little bit different. The United States does have some resources. It does have energy resources, although the energy resources that they have are not as the oil resources specifically and energy resources that used to be cheap and plentiful are no longer as cheap and plentiful as they used to be. So the whole phenomenon of fracked gas and fracked oil uses a different technology, which doesn't have the same financial returns that the old-fashioned, easy-to-use oil had. So that's an issue. But the United States also has enough land. The U.S. could probably be self-sufficient, and if it had decent leadership, it could bring America back to be a truly democratic country where they would empower their own people instead of using them as objects of parasitism. Why is it that to get a credit card you have to pay 30% interest? This is it's ridiculous, and the country is deeply in debt. Most people are deeply in debt. 60% of the people live paycheck to paycheck. All that is unnecessary if there were fair distribution of income and fair distribution of power. So that's the question. Are they going to be able to, what will happen? In closing, I just want to point out, and I didn't point this out in my article, but one hopeful sign that I see is in the case of Palestine, the Christian right, which had been completely behind Israel's domination of Palestine and their subjugation of the Palestinian people and their unquestioning loyalty to Israel. The young people, have seen you see enough brutality, and you say, no, this is not right. We're not going to accept that. That's on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you have many anti-Israeli demonstrators in universities. And those are people on the left. So what I'm wondering is, when will these different factions of the Christian right and the American left say, we talk about, ending the war in Ukraine because all the money is going to Ukraine. We talk about sending money to Israel. And, we agree. We want to have the money spent here on our people. And if you can get the Christian right and the secular left to agree that if this is what MAGA is really about. It's like, how are we going to build a country that works for us, the people, not the billionaires, not the Trumps, not the Democratic Party that's dominated by billionaires, Chaim Saban and BlackRock and all those people. We've got to get control back from those people. That's the real war. This is the class war that is at the heart of all of this stuff. But and the Ukraine war and Palestine are merely, we can say, metastasized examples of a cancerous overall policy. So that is the challenge that we're facing. So that's basically what I have to say on this video. And again, if you would like to support my channel, I'd really appreciate it. You can send any donations to PayPal or to Buy Me a Coffee, or you can buy a subscription to Substack. And I guess that's all for now. Be sure to like and share my video if you found any of this content edifying to you. If you found it useful, you'll learn something that you didn't know before. Please share it with your friends and family. So thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.